The letter was already sealed. Samuela had pressed her thumb against the wax before she allowed herself to think about it too carefully, because thinking about it carefully would have undone her, and she could not afford to come undone in the upper corridor of Ashmore Park with the ballroom noise rising through the floorboards below and 60 pairs of eyes waiting to see what she would do next. She set the letter on the writing table, addressed to Mrs. Arden in her plainest hand, and smoothed the front of her gown once. A gown of pale gray wool that had been retrimmed twice and would not bear a third revision. Then she picked up her gloves from the chair back, drew them on finger by finger, and told herself that leaving quietly was not the same as retreat. She was simply choosing the ending that cost no one else anything. She did not know, as she reached for the door handle of the small room assigned to companions and other such persons of uncertain standing, that the letter would not reach Mrs. Arden's hands. She did not know that a man was already moving through the crowd below, or that he had recognized her handwriting on the direction even before the footman could carry it to its destination. She did not know any of it. She knew only the weight of 400 pounds that had once been her father's debt and was now the shape of her life, and the sound of Lady Dorothea Vane's voice still ringing in her ears with the particular clarity of a pronouncement delivered to an audience. She had been called a paid companion, and nothing more. What she did not yet know was that someone had heard, and that hearing had finally cost him his caution. Samuela had arrived at Ashmore Park on a gray Thursday in October, 11 days before the ball that would unmake everything she had assembled in the way of composure. She had come as Mrs. Arden's companion, which was to say she had come as the woman who carried the shawls and remembered the names and stood slightly behind in receiving lines so as not to trouble the geometry of introductions. Mrs. Arden was a Bath widow of comfortable income and no malice, and she had engaged Samuela 8 months prior with a frankness Samuela had been grateful for. The position was not beneath her in any sense she recognized, though she was 23 years old and had been educated well above it, because the debt her father had left at his death had been 400 pounds precisely, and that sum had reduced the question of what she deserved to a purely theoretical concern. The carriage turned through the Ashmore gates on a lane edged with copper beeches, losing their last leaves, and Mrs. Arden had pressed her hands together and said that the Earl of Ashmore kept a very fine autumn table, which Samuela understood to mean that the invitation mattered to her employer in ways that had nothing to do with the foliage. Ashmore Park came into view around a slow bend, a gray stone house of considerable age, 3 stories, 12 front windows, and a stillness about it that suggested the house had seen enough seasons to stop being surprised by any of them. The entrance hall was stone-flagged and hung with portraits going back further than Samuela cared to count. A footman in Ashmore livery descended the front steps to hand Mrs. Arden down, and then stood at the carriage door in such a way as to make it apparent that he had not noticed Samuela at all, or had noticed her and filed her correctly alongside the luggage. She climbed down herself, which she had done many times and had learned to do without the flicker of embarrassment that used to accompany it. She had her gloves on and her traveling bag in her hand, and she was 3 steps into the hall when a voice came from behind her, even and unhurried. "Marsden. Miss Hartwell is a guest of this house. You will show her the same attention you showed Mrs. Arden." The footman, whose name was apparently Marsden, corrected himself with the speed of a man who knew the voice and feared it. Samuela turned toward the speaker. Nicholas Vane, Earl of Ashmore, stood at the far end of the hall, in the shadow of the corridor that led to the study, dressed for the estate rather than for company in a coat of dark wool with no ornament on it. He was 31 years old and gave the impression of a man who had decided, somewhere in his early 20s, to feel things only in private. His jaw was carved as carefully as the stone of his house. His eyes, which were the gray of overcast water, had moved from the footman to Samuela in the space of one measured breath, and they rested on her for a moment she found impossible to interpret. She said, "Thank you, my lord," because courtesy required it. He said, "Of course," because his habits of command required it, and turned back toward the corridor without another word. She told herself it was habit. Men of his position maintained their households with the same automatic authority with which they maintained their accounts. The correction of a footman meant nothing about her. She believed this entirely. She had excellent reasons to believe it. The house party numbered 14 guests, among them Lady Dorothea Vane, the Dowager Countess, who occupied a suite of rooms in the East Wing and occupied the drawing room in much the same spirit. Completely, as a matter of right, and with a settled confidence that the room had been waiting for her. She was a woman of 60, possessed of fine bones and excellent posture, and a manner of addressing those beneath her notice that was always technically civil and always precisely calibrated to wound. She had arranged herself near the fire on the first evening with Miss Cecily Frome at her right hand, Cecily being 20 years old, and the daughter of Viscount Frome and the possessor of a face of considerable classical regularity. Lady Dorothea had said nothing about Cecily that first evening. She had not needed to. The arrangement spoke entirely for itself. Samuela watched this from her position near the window, where she had placed herself close enough to be useful to Mrs. Arden and far enough from the fire not to intrude. She was learning Ashmore's rhythms, its servants' names and faces, the way the dining room managed 12 and could seat 16 at a strain. The fact that the long library ran the full width of the house's west face and was kept at a temperature that suggested no one had troubled to light it regularly in several years. The room that troubled her was smaller and harder to explain. On her second day at Ashmore, crossing the portrait gallery on an errand for Mrs. Arden, she passed an open door into what she took for a study, and through the doorway she saw a portrait hung on the far wall with its face turned to the plaster. It was a woman's portrait, she thought, from the gilded frame's proportions, and it had been turned deliberately, not carelessly. It stood there with its back to the room and its varnished surface catching none of the light, and Samuela passed on without stopping, because the sorrow of other people's houses was not her affair. Nicholas's ward was an 8-year-old boy named Thomas, who had his guardian's coloring and none of his stillness. Thomas moved through Ashmore the way small animals move through spaces built for large ones, quickly, close to walls, and with an attention to exits that suggested long experience of being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. He had been placed at Ashmore when his parents died of fever 2 years prior, and Lady Dorothea had not troubled to conceal her view that a child underfoot during the autumn party was a failure of household management. Thomas ate in the nursery and appeared downstairs only in the evenings. Briefly, and he played the pianoforte with the uncertain touch of a boy who had been told to practice by someone who did not particularly want to hear the result. The afternoon of the 5th day produced the moment that changed the terms of everything, though Samuela did not understand that until much later. She had gone to the music room because it was empty at that hour, and she wanted 10 minutes in which no one required anything of her. She found Thomas there instead, seated at the pianoforte bench, with his hands flat on the keys and his face arranged in the careful blankness of a child who has learned that visible distress produces consequences. Lady Dorothea was also present, having appeared through the connecting door from the drawing room, and she was in the middle of observing, in a voice pitched just above conversational, that Thomas's playing was an embarrassment to the instrument, and that his father had apparently neglected his musical education as thoroughly as he had neglected everything else. Thomas's hands did not move. He sat very still, which was how Samuela knew he was not well. She set down the book she was carrying, crossed the room, and sat beside Thomas on the pianoforte bench. She said, in a voice that was pleasant and entirely firm, "Thomas, will you show me the piece you have been working on? I've been wondering whether the left-hand entrance in the second section comes better if you let it breathe a little before it joins." She placed her own hand lightly on the keys and played the first 4 bars of a simple air. Not well enough to shame him, and not badly enough to suggest she was performing ignorance. And then she moved her hands away and looked at him with an attention that was honest and without pity. Thomas played the piece. Not perfectly, but not with the uncertain shame that had been there a moment ago. Lady Dorothea, who had been waiting for an audience, found she did not have one, and withdrew through the connecting door with the measured tread of a woman who was noting the offense for future use. Samuela did not look up. She was watching Thomas's hands, because his hands were what mattered. She did not see the figure in the doorway on the far side of the room. She did not see Nicholas standing there, quite still, with his coat untouched, and his face changed in some way that would have been difficult to name but impossible to mistake, watching her sit beside his ward in the gray afternoon light and do the one thing it had apparently not occurred to anyone else to do. He stood there until Thomas reached the end of the piece. Then he stepped back into the corridor without making a sound, and Samuela never knew he had been there at all. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, you already know what she could not see. She would be the last to understand it, as is so often the way with women who have spent sufficient time being told they are not worth understanding. Leave a comment, if you like, and tell me whether you have known that feeling of missing the thing that was plainly visible to everyone else in the room. The library encounter happened 3 days later, on a morning when the rain had made the grounds inaccessible and the house party had scattered itself through the public rooms with the slightly restless air of people who expected better weather. Samuela had gone to the library because it was the room least likely to require her to be decorative. She had taken a volume of correspondence from the shelves, not in any expectation of being permitted to sit with it long, and she was standing at the central table with the book open when Nicholas came through the door with the look of a man who had expected to find an empty room. He did not leave. He crossed to the far shelves, drew out a volume of estate maps, and brought it to the opposite end of the table, and for several minutes they existed in a quiet that had nothing uncomfortable about it, which was itself unusual enough to register. She turned a page. He turned his own, and then he said, without looking up, "You know the Handel sonatas." It was not a question. She had played 2 bars of a Handel air in the music room, and he had heard them from the doorway, and she had not known he was there. She understood this in the space of one held breath, and what it meant about what he had observed. "My father kept a good instrument," she said. "We had little else to recommend us toward the end, but we kept the instrument." He looked up then, not a glance, but a full attention of several seconds, the kind that a man of his controlled habits did not give by accident. "How long ago?" he said. 2 years this December." She closed the book and set it flat on the table, which was not what she had intended to do, but was what her hands did in the presence of a direct question honestly asked. He was a good man who was not practical. The debt he left was £400. I found the position with Mrs. Arden in February. The number sat on the table between them with the bluntness of a fact that had no interest in being softened. She had said it because the alternative was the performance of a stoicism she was growing tired of performing. Nicholas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas has not played willingly in 18 months. He said it to the estate map, not to her. Not since he came to Ashmore. A pause the length of a breath. You sat beside him. He needed someone to sit beside him, Samuela said. It was not a complicated diagnosis. Something moved across his face. She could not name it, and her wound told her she was imagining warmth in a man whose attention to her was precisely the same quality of attention he gave to the maintenance of his household. She believed this, and looked back at the table, and did not see what the audience could see plainly. His hand, which had been flat on the page, pressing once against the wood as though steadying itself, and then going still. What she did not know, and what the household had absorbed into its silence in the way that households absorb the unspeakable, was the grief that lived in the study with the turned portrait. His first wife, Eleanor, had been 19 when he married her, and he had been 26, and she had died 3 years ago in the room that was now kept closed at the end of the east corridor, in childbed, taking the child with her. The physician had said that these things happened, and that no one was at fault, and Nicholas had thanked him and paid him, and spent the following 3 years in the private conviction that he himself was entirely at fault. He had wanted an heir, and Eleanor had wanted time, and he had been 26 and confident in his own judgment, which was a precise description of a man who does not yet understand what his confidence costs other people. The portrait had faced the wall since the night of her funeral. He did not speak of Eleanor. He did not permit her to be spoken of in the household in his presence, because the only words available for what he felt were inadequate to it, and he would not insult her with inadequate words. He had kept her memory as he kept everything he valued, enclosed, protected, and out of reach. He had believed, in the vague and unexamined way of a grieving man who has converted grief into industry, that he would not want to choose someone again. The wanting itself was the risk. Then he had stood in a doorway and watched a woman he barely knew sit down beside a frightened child and play 4 bars of Handel, without a single gesture toward her own credit. He thought, from somewhere he had not expected to hear from. Not yet. And then, with a discipline that 3 years of practice had made nearly automatic. Not at all. He was wrong. He would discover this in stages. Lady Dorothea discovered her own purposes in stages too, and she was considerably less troubled by them. She had attended 4 of Nicholas's house parties in 3 years, and had watched him manage each one with the same sealed competence and the same decisive absence of any inclination toward the women she placed carefully in his vicinity. She had revised her strategy for the Ashmore Autumn Ball with a thoroughness that would have impressed a general, and Cecily Frome was the result of those revisions. Cecily was well-bred, well-connected, unencumbered by opinions that could not be immediately revised, and had the additional virtue of finding Nicholas Vane genuinely attractive, which simplified the social mathematics considerably. Lady Dorothea had arranged for Nicholas to walk with Cecily in the walled garden on the 9th day of the party. She had arranged for them to be seated together at dinner 3 separate evenings. She had made of these arrangements a perfectly natural-looking geography of opportunity, and she was watching their development with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has spent 60 years perfecting the management of situations that are not yet crises and intends to prevent them from becoming crises by force of organization. She had also been watching Samuela with a different quality of attention. The second voicing of the dismissive label came on the 10th day, at a morning gathering in the drawing-room, when Lady Dorothea remarked to Mrs. Pendleton, the wife of a Norfolk baronet, that it was quite characteristic of dear Mrs. Arden to travel with her companion in attendance, though one did hope the girl understood the importance of remaining unobtrusive at larger gatherings, given that companions tended to create a confusion of status that was uncomfortable for everyone. She said this with Mrs. Arden in the adjacent room and Samuela in it, standing at the bookcase returning a volume she had borrowed. Her voice was exactly the volume required to be clearly audible without being technically loud. Samuela replaced the volume, turned, and excused herself from the room without hurrying, because hurrying would have been informative. In the corridor, she stood with her back against the wall for 10 seconds and breathed. Then she put her shoulders back and went to find what Mrs. Arden required of her next. Nicholas had not been in the drawing room. He had been in the study, where Samuela had never been invited, and where the estate agent who managed the Ashmore tenancies had been waiting since 9 in the morning with a set of accounts requiring attention. Samuela did not know what was discussed in that room. She knew only that when Nicholas appeared at luncheon, his face had the particular quality of stillness that she had begun to recognize as the expression of a man containing something he had decided not to release in company. He sat across from her at the table. He had not looked at her when she entered, and she had attributed this to the natural organization of his attention. And then he had passed the serving dish of roasted root vegetables in her direction without waiting for the footman to do it, which was not a natural organization of anything, and she had felt the warmth of the bowl through her gloves and thought precisely nothing of it. This was the nature of her wound. It was not self-pity. It was a well-practiced economy of expectation, learned in the months after her father's death, when the kindness of neighbors had resolved into the clarity of creditors, and she had found that anticipating nothing cost considerably less than anticipating something. The ball was on the 11th evening. Ashmore Park dressed itself for the occasion in candlelight, the wall sconces lit and the great chandelier above the ballroom floor brought to its full illumination for the first time in 3 years. Samuela had heard from the housekeeper, a stout and candid woman named Mrs. Pruitt, that the chandelier had not been lit since the last occasion of the Earl's entertaining before his wife's death, and that it required 2 footmen and a specific arrangement of pulleys to manage, and that Mr. Marsden had nearly come to grief on the ladder that afternoon. 60 guests arrived across the span of an hour, carriages in the drive and lanterns on the gate-posts, and the particular festive noise of a gathering that believes itself to be the most important event of the autumn. The gowns were, by and large, silk and velvet in the saturated colors that the candlelight rewarded. Samuela wore the gray wool, retrimmed for the occasion with a length of cream ribbon she had purchased in Bath with her own money. And she looked entirely correct and entirely plain among the jewels. And she minded this about as much as she minded the cold. She had had 11 days to reconcile herself to what she was inside Ashmore, and she had done so with the thoroughness that had become her particular talent. She managed Mrs. Arden's shawl and Mrs. Arden's card case and Mrs. Arden's introductions, and she found her employer a chair near enough to the dancing to be companionable and far enough from the French doors to avoid the draught. She fetched ratafia and declined to take any herself, because a companion who accepts refreshment is a companion who forgets she is not a guest. She watched Cecily Frome take the floor with Nicholas for the first dance, which was a country set of 8 couples, and she noted that they moved well together, which they did, and she noted that Nicholas's face during the dance was exactly the same controlled courtesy. It was at dinner, which it was, and she told herself that this observation was not interesting to her. Lady Dorothea watched the same dance from her chair near the hearth and permitted herself the expression of a woman whose arrangements are proceeding correctly. It was during the interval between the second and third sets that Lady Dorothea performed the act that would become the hinge of the evening. She had positioned herself near the long windows that opened onto the garden side of the ballroom, and she had arranged around her a cluster of 6 or 8 of the more senior guests, including Sir William Pendleton and his wife, a Lady Marsh, whose opinion of everyone was well established and well distributed, and Mrs. Arden herself, who had drifted in that direction following the second dance in the natural social current of the room. Samuela was standing 4 feet away, behind Mrs. Arden's left shoulder, in the position she had occupied all evening. Lady Dorothea said, raising her voice just enough to carry to the small crowd around her and the larger crowd immediately adjacent, that she had noticed that Mrs. Arden's companion had a habit of placing herself rather prominently at events that were not designed with her comfort in mind, and she did hope that dear Mrs. Arden did not find it a burden, managing a paid companion at house parties where the social distinctions were so carefully maintained. She said it with the sympathy one reserves for people dealing with minor inconveniences of household management. She said it in front of 60 persons, or the portion of them who were in the ballroom and attending, which at that moment was nearly all of them, a paid companion and nothing more, and Samuela heard every word. The room heard every word. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides and the cream ribbon at her throat, and her eyes level, because she had been trained to hold herself correctly, and she would not give Lady Dorothea the satisfaction of a visible wound, and she felt beneath the surface of that discipline a cold and very clear understanding that she could not stay, not because she was ashamed, because to remain would be to participate in a fiction that she was welcome, and she had spent enough of her life participating in fictions. Mrs. Arden made a small sound. Lady Marsh looked at her fan. Sir William Pendleton examined the middle distance. 3 separate people heard exactly what had been said, and said nothing, and said nothing, and said nothing, the way rooms do when someone powerful says something that is technically true and thoroughly unkind. Samuela excused herself quietly from Mrs. Arden's side. She went up the main stairs at a pace that was not quite hurrying. She found the writing table in the small room assigned to companions and other such persons of uncertain standing. She unsealed the ink. She wrote to Mrs. Arden in her plainest hand 3 short paragraphs that thanked her employer with genuine feeling and explained that she would arrange her own conveyance to Bath in the morning, and that Mrs. Arden should not be troubled on her account. She sealed the letter. She pressed her thumb against the wax. She picked up her gloves. Below her, in the ballroom, Nicholas had been standing at the far end of the room when Lady Dorothea spoke. He had been watching Cecily Frome accept a glass of lemonade from a young man she was clearly charming, and he had been thinking about the estate agent's accounts, which was what he thought about when he was in a room he did not want to be in. He heard his mother's voice in the particular carrying register she used for statements she intended to be heard. He heard the words. He heard the quality of silence that followed them. He turned to look for Samuela. She was already moving toward the door, her back straight and her chin level and her gray gown the plainest thing in the room. He watched her cross the ballroom floor and step through the door into the corridor beyond. And something in his chest performed a maneuver he had not authorized. He crossed to where the footman Marsden was stationed near the door and said in a voice that was level and specific, "Miss Hartwell will have written a letter. Find it before it is delivered, and bring it to me." Marsden went. Nicholas stood at the edge of the ballroom and looked at the space where Samuela had been, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, the particular discomfort of a man who is about to do something costly and has already stopped looking for reasons not to. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who brought the letter down, because she had found Marsden standing in the upper corridor looking uncertain and had taken the matter into her own capable hands, and who placed it in Nicholas's palm with the expression of a woman who has managed this household through a great deal and knows which of its situations require no comment. He looked at the direction. Samuela's handwriting was careful and even. The hand of someone who had been taught well and written often and was not performing elegance. He put the letter in his coat pocket. He turned to look at the ballroom, at the 60 persons arranged in the candlelight of a chandelier that had been dark for 3 years, at his mother near the windows with Lady Marsh's approval and Sir William Pendleton's careful neutrality, at Cecily Frome, who was young and correct and had done nothing wrong and was not the person he was thinking about, at the door through which Samuela Hartwell had walked with her chin level and her gray gown and her 4 bars of handle and her complete, habitual certainty that she was not worth looking for. He crossed the ballroom, not quickly. There was nothing in his pace that was not entirely deliberate, which was the most deliberate thing about it. The 60 guests registered his movement in the way rooms register the movement of the most powerful person in them. First a turning of heads, then a turning of bodies, then a stillness that spread from his path outward, like a tide reversing. Lady Dorothea saw him from the windows. Her composure did not change, but something behind it did. Some small, mechanized certainty that had been running for 60 years, and for one moment, it misfired. He stopped at the foot of the main stairs. He said, clearly, to the room, "Mrs. Pruitt, will you ask Miss Hartwell to come down?" Mrs. Pruitt, who had been waiting on the far side of the door for approximately 45 seconds, went up the stairs. The ballroom was very quiet. The musicians had stopped between sets and had not started again. Because the musicians understood atmospheres, and this one did not invite a country reel. Lady Dorothea said from the windows, "Nicholas, what are you doing?" He turned to look at her. His face was the face of a man who has made a decision and is not in any uncertainty about it. He said, "I am correcting a misunderstanding, Mother. You described Miss Hartwell as a paid companion." "She is a paid companion," Lady Dorothea said. There was an edge in her voice, something that was not quite confidence, but was working very hard at the impression of it. "She is a guest in this house," he said, "and she has been treated as though she were not, and I intend to correct that." He looked up the stairs. Samuela was at the top. She had heard Mrs. Pruitt's knock, and had opened the door with the faint bewilderment of someone whose plans have encountered an obstacle they had not modeled. She had come to the top of the staircase, and she stood there in her gray gown with the cream ribbon at her throat, looking down at 60 people and 1 man. And the body's honest account of the moment was this. Her heart was audible in her own ears, and her hands inside her gloves were cold, and she could not read the expression on Nicholas's face, because it was the face of a man who had stopped managing his expression. He looked up at her. The candlelight from the chandelier his wife had not lived to see again fell across the banister and across the stairs, and touched the cream ribbon at Samuela's throat. He said, "Miss Hartwell, I have your letter." He drew it from his coat pocket and held it up, visible to the room. "I am returning it to you unopened, because the reason for which it was written does not exist. You are not leaving Ashmore." Silence. The particular silence of a room that has understood something. Lady Dorothea made a small sound. Cecily Frome, standing near Mrs. Pendleton, looked at Nicholas with the clear-eyed recognition of a young woman who is sensible enough to know when a field has been decided, and felt something that was not humiliation, and was not quite relief, but was the specific sensation of realizing one has been spared a marriage that would have been comfortable, and nothing more. Samuela said, from the top of the stairs, "My lord, I think you have misunderstood the situation." Her voice was entirely steady, and he knew she was managing it. And he thought, briefly, and with a precision that surprised him, that he had never known anyone to manage quite as much for quite as long. "I have not misunderstood it," he said. "I have watched it for 11 days. Come down." She came down, not because he commanded her exactly, but because the alternative required that she continue to believe something that was not true, and she was tired, tonight especially, of believing things that were not true simply because they were the only things that had been offered to her. She reached the last step. He was standing at the foot of the stairs, and the distance between them was such that the candlelight fell on both of them, and the 60 guests were very quiet, and Mrs. Arden was standing with both hands pressed together, and the expression of a woman who is extremely pleased with something she is too well bred to applaud. Nicholas held the letter out. She took it. Their fingers did not touch, but the space between them was small enough that the air held warmth, and she felt it. He said quietly enough that the nearest guests could hear, but the far end of the room required listening for it. Miss Hartwell. Samuela, I should have said this more clearly, and a good deal earlier. You are not a peripheral figure in this house. You are not a companion or an inconvenience or a social confusion. You are the only person who has sat beside Thomas of her own choosing in 18 months. You are the only person who has spoken to me in this house as though I were a person rather than a title. I would very much prefer that you remained at Ashmore. Not for the party. After it. The room absorbed this. Lady Dorothea had gone, in some inner and invisible way, quite still. The way a structure goes still when something at its base has shifted. She said nothing. She had understood, with the clarity of a woman of 60 years' experience, that the machinery she had spent 3 weeks calibrating had produced a result that was entirely outside her specifications, and that the time for managing it had been before the man crossed the ballroom, and she had spent that time at the window saying the wrong thing to the wrong audience. Sir William Pendleton, who had said nothing during her original remark, said "Hear, hear," into the silence, quietly, as a man does when he wants to mark where he stands without making a speech of it. Samuela looked at the letter in her hand. £400, her father's debt, the shape of her life, pressed flat in wax beneath her thumbnail. She looked at Nicholas, who was watching her with the expression of a man who has been careful for 3 years and is prepared to stop. She said, "You should know that I am not looking for rescue." "I know," he said. "Neither was I. I found one nonetheless." A pause, brief as a held breath. "As did you, I think, if you are willing." She let herself look at him directly, then, which she had been careful not to do on any occasion, where doing so would have meant something she could not afford to mean. He held her gaze. His face was, at this moment, entirely without the management she had observed across 11 days, and what it showed was not a man of rank extending his condescension downward. It was a man who was afraid she would say no. "Yes," she said. The word was simple. It had no performance in it. He took the letter from her hand and folded it once and placed it back in his coat pocket, which was not a gesture toward the room. It was a gesture toward her, and she understood it. The musicians, who had been waiting with considerable patience, took up their instruments and found a chord, and the ballroom began to recover its voice, and Lady Dorothea was led by a kind Lady Marsh toward a chair near the fire, where she sat with her fan at the measured height of a woman whose dignity requires maintenance, and did not speak again for quite some time. 3 days after the ball, Nicholas's solicitor arrived from London with a set of documents and a particular brevity of manner that suggested he had been given clear instructions and intended to execute them without commentary. Samuela was in the library when the solicitor came and went. She heard nothing of what was discussed. She heard, that evening, from Mrs. Arden, who had it from Mrs. Pruitt, who had it from no one in particular because she knew the house's business as thoroughly as she knew its pantry inventory, that a payment of £400 had been discharged against an account held in the name of the late Mr. Gerald Hartwell of Bath, and that the account was now closed. Samuela sat with this fact for a long time after Mrs. Arden said good night. The fire in her room had been built up against the first cold night of November, and it was the kind of fire that a house builds for a guest rather than for an inconvenience. And she noted this, and noted also the specific quality of her feeling about it, which was not gratitude for rescue and was not debt to the man who had arranged it, and was something rather more like the sensation of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it, set down at last by someone else's hands. She did not weep. She sat with the fire and the absence of the weight and the altered shape of the night. Winter came to Ashmore in the second week of November, as though it had been waiting for the right occasion. The first snow arrived on a Tuesday, light and early, and settled on the parterres and the copper beeches and the stone face of the house with the silence that first snowfall always carries, the hush of something beginning. Samuela stood at the window of the library, where she had by this time established a kind of quiet territorial claim to the chair nearest the cold pane, and watched the flakes cross the gray morning light. The room behind her was warmer than it had been in early October, because someone had begun attending to the fire, and that someone was, as she had eventually been told by Mrs. Pruitt, without either of them making an occasion of it. The Earl. Nicholas came in at 10:30 with Thomas at his side, which had become the pattern of the mornings since the ball. Thomas had grown, in 3 weeks, something that was not quite bolder, but was perhaps the early stages of boldness, the condition of a child who has discovered that a particular room is safe and is cautiously extending the perimeter of that safety outward. He went directly to the pianoforte without being asked, which was new, and sat on the bench, and looked at the keys with the calculating expression of someone preparing for an undertaking that matters. Nicholas stood beside Samuela at the window. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth he carried from the colder rooms of the house. He said nothing. She said nothing. They watched the snow. Thomas played the opening of the piece he had been working on, the one with the left-hand entrance in the second section. He reached the difficult bar. He played it carefully, and not perfectly, and without stopping. "There," Samuela said quietly. "Yes," Nicholas said. He had gone to the study that morning, before breakfast, and done the thing he had been building toward for 3 weeks. He had turned the portrait of Eleanor back to face the room. He had stood with her for a few minutes, in the gray morning light, and told her what he thought she deserved to know, which was that he had been sorry for 3 years, and he would be sorry always. And it had not been enough. And he had decided that was not the same thing as being finished. He thought she would have said something wry and direct about that, because she had been wry and direct, and he had been too young at 26 to value this as highly as it deserved. He thought she would, if the dead have opinions about such things, have very little patience with a man who converted her memory into a reason to do nothing. He had left the portrait facing the room and come down to the library. Now he looked at Samuela in the morning light, at her profile against the white garden, at the plain wool of her sleeve and the steadiness she carried in her shoulders, and he thought that the things he valued most seemed to require no decoration to make themselves visible. He had simply been standing in the wrong doorways for 3 years, and then one day he had been standing in the right one. Thomas finished the piece. The last note settled into the room, and the snow came down outside, and the fire in the library held its warmth against the winter walls. Nicholas turned from the window and said, "Thomas, come here." Thomas came, in the slightly wary way of a boy who has not yet fully trusted that good things continue. Nicholas put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and it was not a performance for Samuela's benefit. It was a man learning, in stages, to be the guardian he should have been from the beginning. "Well done," Nicholas said. Thomas considered this and did not answer, which was how he showed that something had landed. Later, when Thomas had gone up to the nursery for his lessons, and Mrs. Pruitt had brought a tray that Samuela had not asked for, and Nicholas had not refused, they sat in the library with the snow still falling and the quiet of Ashmore around them, and Samuela reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out the sealed letter she had been carrying since the night of the ball. She had not destroyed it. She was not sure why she had kept it, only that it had seemed important to hold it as evidence of where she had been and where she was now, and the distance between those two things. She set it on the table between them. Nicholas looked at it. He said, "Keep it." She kept it. Outside, the snow fell on the parterres and the copper beeches and the gray stone face of Ashmore Park, and the house received the winter the way it received all seasons, steadily, without surprise, with the patience of something that has stood long enough to believe in what endures. And inside the library, in the light of a fire attended for the first time in years, two people sat in a quiet that asked nothing of them except that they remain in it. The key to the east wing had been placed on Samuela's writing table that morning, when she rose. It was old iron, heavy in the hand, the kind of key that is the right size for what it opens. She had carried it in her pocket all day without taking it out until now, and now she set it beside the letter. Two small objects on a library table, the distance between her old life and this one compressed into a palm span of worn iron and sealed wax. The fire cracked once and settled. Outside, the snow fell. Thomas's last note was still in the room somewhere, the way music stays in a room after the player has gone, not heard but remembered by the walls. She was home. If this story moved you, as Samuela's long winter of waiting and one quiet act of courage moved me in the telling of it, leave a word in the comments. Tell me which moment you felt most, the doorway Nicholas stood in while she never looked up, or the stairs, or the morning after, when the portrait was finally turned to face the room. These stories ask to be witnessed, and so do the people who find something true in them.